In the spring of 1889, an ethnographer named James Wentworth Pratt arrived in the Owens Valley region of central Nevada with a government commission, 2 mules, and a set of blank ledgers issued by the Bureau of Ethnology in Washington. He had been sent to document the land-use customs of the western Shoshone before the treaty renegotiation scheduled for 1891. He was supposed to be counting fishing territories and winter campsites. What he recorded instead, in 73 handwritten pages that have never been cited in any published history of the region, was the oral testimony of 4 Shoshone elders concerning a set of chambers they called, in their own language, the work of beings who came before memory. I came to this through a different door than most researchers. I was reading through the land survey correspondence of the 1880s, the administrative letters between field agents and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, trying to understand how the western Shoshone lost their formal claim to the Ruby Valley Treaty lands so quickly after 1863, when a footnote in a bound volume at the Nevada State Library pointed me to a collection that had never been digitized. It was listed simply as Pratt, J.W. Field Notes, 1889, Owens Valley Region. The archivist told me that most people who came looking for Shoshone ethnographic material never asked for it. I asked because I was looking for something else entirely. I was tracing the patterns of how treaty documentation was transmitted, or not transmitted, back to Washington during that decade. I was interested in what got omitted, and why, and by whom. That changed what I was looking at entirely. Because Pratt's commission was routine, his assignment was unremarkable. What was not routine was that he stayed. He was supposed to complete his survey in 6 weeks. He stayed 4 months. And in those 4 months, he filled every ledger he had brought with him and wrote the final 30 pages on brown paper he bought from a trading post near the settlement at Belmont. There is no formal record explaining why he extended his time in the field. There is only what he wrote and what he chose when he returned to Washington, not to submit. By the time this account is finished, you will understand what the Shoshone elders told James Wentworth Pratt about the chambers, and who they said made them, and why that testimony, documented by a federal employee in the summer of 1889, was never transmitted to his supervisors in Washington, and never appeared in the official record of that survey, or any survey that followed it. The chambers themselves are where this begins. Pratt first heard about them from an elder he referred to in his notes only as the older of the 2 brothers. He was careful not to record personal names without consent, which was unusual for the ethnographic practice of his era, and tells you something about how seriously he was listening. The elder described locations that Pratt initially understood as natural caves, and his early notes reflect that assumption clearly. He wrote, on the 3rd page of the 2nd ledger, that the sites being described were probably volcanic in origin, consistent with known geological formations of the Central Basin. He was wrong about that. He would know he was wrong by the end of the 2nd week. What changed his mind was the description of the interior geometry. Shoshone oral tradition has words for natural caves. It also has distinct words for man-made enclosures and for ceremonial structures. But the word the elder used for these chambers, Pratt transliterated it as Tokamu Way, was neither of those categories. He noted in the margin that the elder explicitly corrected him when Pratt used the word for cave, shaking his head with some impatience and using instead a compound construction that Pratt translated, carefully and with acknowledged uncertainty, as the shaped inside places of the ones who understood the sky. Consider that for a moment. Not caves, not houses, shaped inside places. The distinction mattered to the elder in a way that Pratt recognized, even through his own incomplete understanding of what was being communicated. The physical descriptions that followed were not vague. They were specific in the way that a person describes something they have seen. or that their teachers described with the kind of exactness that only comes from wanting the knowledge to survive the telling intact. The chambers, according to all 4 elders Pratt eventually interviewed, were not one site. They were several, at least 7, and all 4 elders agreed on 7, spread across what we now call the Central and Northern Great Basin, connected not by roads or trails but by something the elders described as alignment. They pointed in particular directions when they said this. They did not gesture loosely at the landscape. They pointed, deliberately, with their arms extended, the way a surveyor points when he knows exactly where something is and wants you to understand that his certainty is not approximate. The walls of the chambers, the elders said, were made of crystal, not decorated with crystal formations, not containing outcroppings of mineral vein, but walls that were themselves crystalline, as though the chamber had been shaped from a continuous and translucent stone. Pratt recorded that one elder illustrated this property by holding his hand against a window in the morning light and saying that the walls were like that, but all the way around, and the light came through, but changed. Pratt spent 2 substantial paragraphs in his notes trying to work out what changed meant before concluding, honestly, that he lacked the vocabulary in either language to fully understand what was being described to him. He did not dismiss the description. He sat with his inadequacy and wrote it down. This is the part I keep returning to, because there is no geological process that produces a chamber with crystalline walls that transmit and alter light in the way the elders described. Quartz veins run throughout the basin ranges of Nevada, and crystal cave systems of extraordinary scale exist elsewhere in the continent. But a constructed, shaped interior space with walls that respond to light in a designed way is not something that forms without intention. It is not geology. The elders were not describing a natural wonder they had stumbled upon. They were describing something they understood to have been deliberately made by people who knew what they were making and why. And that distinction is precisely why what happens next in Pratt's notes matters as much as it does. By the 6th week, Pratt had arranged, through the elder he called the older of the 2 brothers, to be taken to one of the sites. He described the journey in careful detail, 2 days by horse moving northeast from the Belmont settlement, then on foot across a broad and rocky basin floor, then a descent through a rock field that he found physically difficult, and that he suspected had been made difficult by design. He wrote that the rocks of the descent showed a kind of evenness of placement that I could not attribute to natural forces, as though they had been arranged to discourage approach without preventing it entirely. That phrase stayed with him. He returned to it. He wrote it a second time, 2 pages later, and underlined discourage without preventing. He reached the entrance on the 3rd day. He did not go inside. This is documented clearly in his notes. There is no ambiguity, no coyness, no gap in the record. He writes that his guide stopped at the entrance, which was a low opening in a rock face that showed signs of having been worked on its upper edge, not roughly chipped but smoothed, and indicated with considerable clarity that Pratt could not enter. That entry was not permitted for anyone who did not carry certain knowledge into that space. Pratt recorded that he did not argue the point. He wrote, in the measured bureaucratic language of a federal employee confronting something he had no categories for, I accepted this condition and recorded instead what I could observe from without. What he could observe from without was this. The entrance faced precisely northeast. He had a compass. He checked the reading twice, because the rocky terrain sometimes affects instruments. Northeast, both times. The rock face surrounding the entrance showed, along a horizontal seam about 4 feet from the ground, a series of marks that Pratt described as neither pictographs nor written language, but a system of marks organized by repetition and interval, like a notation, though not for music. He sketched them in his ledger. They were not random. They had an internal grammar, a unit that repeated, varied, and repeated again, in a sequence that his sketch suggests ran for approximately 8 feet along that seam, before ending cleanly at a vertical crack in the rock face. The sketches are still there, in the third ledger, at the Nevada State Library. I sat with them for most of an afternoon and have not found their equivalent in any cataloged survey of petroglyphic or pictographic markings from the Great Basin region. The elder who brought him there, when Pratt asked about the marks, was silent for a long time. Then he said, and Pratt recorded this in quotation marks, which in his field notes he reserved strictly for things he considered verbatim, "These are the instructions left by the makers. They are for anyone who builds again." Builds again. The question is not whether James Wentworth Pratt was a reliable observer. He was trained as an ethnographer at a time when that practice demanded rigorous skepticism toward exactly the kind of testimony he was receiving. He noted his own uncertainty at every turn. He proposed alternative explanations, and then documented why those explanations failed to account for the specifics of what 4 independent speakers were telling him across weeks of separate conversation. That is not the process of a man who arrived with a conclusion he wanted to confirm. That is the behavior of a man who trusted his method and then found that his method was not built for what he encountered. The question is, why none of this went to Washington? Pratt's official report, submitted in January of 1890, runs to 12 pages. It addresses fishing rights, seasonal camp boundaries, and 2 ranchers who were grazing cattle on treaty-protected land without authorization. It contains no reference to the chambers, no reference to the crystal walls, no reference to the elders' account of beings who came before the Shoshone were a people, or to the 7 sites, or to what the sites were built for. The report reads exactly like the 6-week survey he had been commissioned to complete. Not a word more. Not a word that would require explanation. The 73 pages of field notes were not transmitted with it. They were not cited in it. They were filed, apparently by Pratt himself according to the library's accession record, within a private genealogical collection that was donated to the Nevada State Library in 1931 by his niece, who seems to have had no idea what she was handing over. The ledgers were cataloged under personal correspondence and field notes. J. W. Pratt, Nevada Territory, 1889. They sat in that category for 93 years, until a librarian cross-referencing an unrelated collection noticed the Bureau of Ethnology letterhead stamped on the cover of the first ledger. There was no inquiry into why they were there instead of in the federal record. There was no effort to understand the discrepancy between those notes and the official report. Consider what that means. A federal employee, trained by the Bureau of Ethnology, extends a 6-week assignment to 4 months without explaining why. He fills 3 times the documentation he was issued. He travels to a site that requires 3 days and significant physical difficulty to reach. He records his observations with the care of a man who understands that what he is seeing may not be seen again. And then he submits a 12-page report to Washington that mentions none of it. That is a deliberate choice. That is someone calculating, clearly, precisely, what they were and were not willing to put in writing addressed to the federal government of 1889. And the account he kept instead is in that third ledger, on brown paper from a trading post, in a handwriting that grows smaller toward the end, as though he were trying to fit more in before the paper ran out. Because by the final pages, Pratt had spoken with all 4 elders, and the composite account they gave him about the builders of the chambers was specific in a way he described as disturbing to my prior understanding of the human record in this part of the continent. The elders agreed on every significant point. The beings who built the chambers had arrived in the territory before the Shoshone were a people. One elder used a phrase Pratt translated as "before the world took the shape it has," which Pratt understood not as mythological shorthand, but as a reference to geological time, noting that these same elders had elsewhere during the survey demonstrated accurate knowledge of landscape change over very long periods. The builders were not remembered as gods, not as spirits, as people with knowledge that others did not yet have, who built chambers that did something particular with light and stone and directional alignment, something the elders described, in different formulations across different conversations, as making the sick well. Making the sick well. The chamber was a healing structure, not a temple. Not a burial site, not a ceremonial space in any sense that Pratt could match to his existing knowledge of indigenous sacred architecture. A place where something in the crystalline walls and the angle of the morning light and the precise direction the entrance faced produced a consistent, documented, and deliberate effect on people who were brought inside it. The elders described the protocol. A person was brought in during morning hours when light entered through the northeast-facing opening. They remained for a prescribed period. The duration was specific, and the elders agreed on it, though Pratt's translation leaves the unit uncertain. Someone who carried the knowledge stayed with them throughout, and the 4 elders, speaking separately in different sessions, with different emphases, were unanimous on the outcome. It worked. Not occasionally. Consistently, for specific conditions they named. And that, the naming of specific conditions, is the thing I found I could not dismiss. This knowledge does not appear in any other Shoshone ethnographic record from the same period that I have been able to locate. The terminology the elders used doesn't correspond to the documented vocabularies of Shoshone healing practice compiled by other surveyors of the 1880s and 1890s. Which suggests the knowledge was specific to those 4 individuals, those who had maintained a custodial relationship with the chambers long after the structures themselves had become inaccessible. By 1889, Pratt understood, he was almost certainly speaking with the last people alive who held that relationship. That awareness is present in the tone of the brown paper pages. He was not documenting a living tradition. He was being handed the final copy of something, and he knew it. Because the Shoshone account was not singular in the larger record. The Paiute, whose territory overlaps with the central Great Basin, carry oral traditions referencing underground places of stone that faced the rising sun and were made by a people whose name translates roughly as the first builders. The Ute, east of the Shoshone Range, have stories of crystal rooms beneath the mountains sealed during a conflict so ancient that no living generation could name when it occurred. The Northern Paiute, the Bannock, the Goshute. When you lay those accounts alongside Pratt's notes, and you look at what they agree on without having spoken to each other, without having had the opportunity to harmonize their traditions through contact, a pattern emerges that I have not been able to explain away. The northeast alignment of the entrances. The crystal walls. The healing function attributed consistently across peoples who did not share a single tradition. These are not the same story carried across different mouths. These are different peoples describing, from different distances and different inheritances, the same physical thing. 7 sites, the elders said. Possibly more. No formal archaeological survey has ever searched for them. That is not an accident of priority or funding allocation. The Bureau of Ethnology received Pratt's 12-page report in 1890 and moved on to the next survey. Whatever might have existed in the Ruby Valley Basin, in the high country northeast of what is now Tonopah, in the rock fields that Elder navigated with the quiet confidence of long memory, it was never mapped, never excavated, never officially acknowledged as a thing worth looking for. And the 4 men who knew where to look are gone. That is what this record leaves behind, not the question of what crystal does to light in a specifically shaped chamber, though that question is real and I am not the person to answer it. Not the question of who the builders were, or how far back the alignment of those 7 sites reaches into a time before the landscape had the shape it has now. What this leaves behind is the image of 4 elders sitting across from a government surveyor in the summer of 1889, choosing to give him something, choosing, at considerable cost to their own tradition of careful guardianship, to describe what they knew in enough detail that a man trained to document could actually write it down. They were precise. They were patient. They corrected him when he was wrong. And they knew by 1889 what was happening to the world that had held that knowledge. They told him anyway, and he wrote it down and chose not to send it and tucked it into his private papers. And 93 years passed, and the elders died, and the people who might have found the chambers died, and what those chambers contained, whatever configuration of crystal and light and careful orientation, was doing something we no longer have the framework to evaluate, is sealed now, or collapsed, or lying under the ordinary quiet surface of a basin that never knew to look. A technology for healing, given once, in a summer, in good faith, across the full distance of 2 languages that barely reached each other, lost because the man who received it could not afford to deliver it. If someone brought this to you, pass it to someone who needs to hear it.